Hello, guys! Finally, the most important text of all time has been released. Forget the Bible, forget Newton's works, forget Einstein's works, forget about Plato, Aristotle. Nothing is important. Any of these things are not as important as this thing here in front of your eyes, the theory of no knowledge and the new science, a philosophical and scientific revolution applied to practical life. So be ready for this because this will be the beginning of a new era. So, abstract. The theory of no knowledge, although initially paradoxical, proposes a reasoned rejection of conventional attempts to acquire absolute knowledge through the introduction of nullification, a tool that allows the denial of knowledge without generating contradiction. With the application of this tool, new science emerges. A pragmatic and effective approach that proposes solutions applicable to real life in a field without the limitations and or presum- presum- presumptions. Maybe presuppositions could be a better word for this. Presumptions is good too. Of traditional theories. This article analyzes the origins and implications of TNK and NS, confronting them with traditional philosophical and scientific theories, showing how TNK offers a more efficient and pragmatic approach for a more prosperous, fair, and practical society, from the individual to the large social and political spheres. So let's take a look. I've taken this text from an old book of mine. Actually, it was my first. I usually say that this book was my first, but also my last too, because this is the beginning and the end of knowledge. This yellow book right here, the theory of no knowledge. Let me show you guys. I've released this book in a website in Brazil, but I didn't like to put any reference to this thing because I wasn't a formal philosopher back then. I was creating this text just by my guts. I was really interested in explaining things. And afterwards, I've decided to enter in a philosophical course. Now I'm a master in philosophy of language. I've been publishing some papers about the relationship between ontology, existence, and of course, language. And this is what we were going to talk about here. So, introduction. Throughout history, humanity has strived to seek knowledge. From ancient Greece through the Middle Ages and the scientific revolution to the present day, philosophers and scientists have attempted to offer definitive explanations about reality. However, the search never seems to have reached an ending point, always falling into either first, infinite regressions of definitions. Try, for example, to define a cup, and you'll see that you have to use several concepts, which themselves need definitions and thus infinite regress. Or two, contradictions. The term is and it is not definable at the same time. And or three, limitations. The terms do not have practical applications at a satisfactory and or ultimate level of clarity that prevent the attainment of a universal truth or perfect knowledge. The theory of no knowledge, the TNK, was developed to respond to this failure in the process of acquiring knowledge. So instead of trying to justify absolute knowledge, TNK seeks to create a non contradictory and functional unity through nullification. Take a look. I have invented this connective, and we are going to see how this works very soon, allowing us to finally deal with real problems without the need to reconstruct infinite philosophical theories or try to reach a universally applicable truth. Since TNK itself is, in itself, the starting point and the only reliable truth for creating applicable unities of knowledge. From this solid foundation, new science emerges, which, unlike traditional science, offers pragmatic, functional, and effective solutions to the contemporary challenges of human life. So we are going to see that Since it's very problematic to define a concept, like let's try, for example, the cup. You have to use a lot of concepts to define the concept of cup, and a lot of concepts to define each one of the concepts that you have used to define cup, and so on. So it means that the knowledge is impossible. So we would have to deny knowledge then, since this is impossible. But to use negation, you are going to use the knowledge to deny knowledge itself. So this is not a good idea. So let's create this tool here called nullification. And with this, you can deny the knowledge without entering the contradiction that says that negation is negating itself. This is by definition. Chapter 1: Failure of traditional philosophical and scientific theories, the challenge of definitions and standard reality. Infinity. We know that the concept of infinity, whether philosophical or mathematical, makes another concept quite difficult, that of definition. The knowledge of the existence of something that can extend and consequentially divide indefinitely makes it impossible for us, for example, to establish a starting point for the perception of the existence of this something, as well as its middle or end. So since you can divide any space in infinite parts, maybe you will never reach this part that you want to find, right? This impasse becomes clear when we discover the set of real numbers and know that between any two numbers, supposedly allocated on an abstract real line, there are infinite numbers greater than the smaller one and smaller than the larger one, and that this process can be repeated using the same numbers that we admitted and so on, automatically making it possible to assume that it is possible to establish even one number on the line. So even to create the space, this number here is in another space. So the limits are itself or are themselves uh, susceptible to be divided. Now, if the numerical space existing between two numbers can be infinitely divided, so that the result of this division makes us allocate more numbers in it, it implies that the very starting point of the analysis, that is, one of the two numbers, can also be considered one of these spaces, if in another analysis it is between two others. In other words, it can also be infinitely divided, and therefore the mission of numerical allocation becomes an indefinitely long task, humanly and logically unfeasible. And without an end point or starting point, you know, we don't know how to start to count things anymore because everything can be infinitely divided. So on exact sciences, there is also a debate that remains unresolved to this day. Has physics given rise to mathematics or vice versa? Immanuel Kant says that although synthetic a priori judgment can exist, no knowledge could have begun outside of experience. But wouldn't that require us to have beforehand an abstract mental apparatus, however rudimentary, to interpret the elements of the environment? It reminds us a lot of idealism and realism debates. Because let's take a look. This is a debate that you should start since the beginning of any debate whatsoever. Is the world uh, an objective reality? Like it exists by itself, but you will never know if you don't have a mind to perceive it. So we would call this idealism. If the world needs your mind to determine that things exist, we are saying that the reality is idealistic. But if there be a real and material objective reality without the need of someone to see these things exist, we could call this a realistic world, you know. But we know that this is impossible to solve because to prove that the world is realistic, you would have to have your mind to see that yes, there is a world that is realistic. So this is very problematic, you know. And the other case is to say that, but if the world depends on my mind, how can you prove that Even if everyone died, the world couldn't simply stay there. So it's impossible to solve this problem, and this is basically the main problem of all the philosophy. Since the history of the emergence of numbers, about men who needed to count their flocks with stones without numbers, but based on a one-to-one connection or geometry itself, which shamelessly use intuitive entities acquired through experience and observation of the real world, the point, the line, and the plane, from which all spatial studies that we know today arise. There has always been an intrinsic and apparently non-primacy relationship between theory and practice. So, in other words, we don't know what has come first, the the material or the theory. You would have to have the material to have things to abstract to your mind, but without the mind and without the concepts of the mind, you would never abstract things from the material world. But if the point arose from that object that our means of observation were unable to distinguish from another, or of the same size and distance, that is, because of a physical biological limitation of our eyes, then perhaps with greater technology, or even a closer approximation, we see that the points were in fact two objects that were very different from each other and very divisible. And with that, we notice the importance of studying the real origin of such premises, since depending on which one it is, we will be able to obtain various answers to the contradictions that are strangely masked, due to the fact that ignoring them is useful in practical life, economically even. So that thing that Rene Descartes has said before, now that my senses deceive me. So sometimes we don't know whether that point further away isn't actually a building or a living being. We don't know. And so depending on things, on your own senses, is quite dangerous. So we have a lot of things here. I invite you to read these things one by one. There are a lot of topics, and I am always trying to say that about these very basic things to determine the foundations of knowledge. We always have a problem, and these problems talk to each other. So on logic, on language, on efficiency, on faith, on reality, on creator, on the taxonomy of reality and efficiency. Denial is something very important. We are going to see in a footnote in the future that there is a knowledge called paraconsistent negation, in which we say that, like for example, two doctors say that the patient X is suffering from a disease. One says that this guy is about to die, the other one says that he's not. So you would have to develop a kind of a connective, kind of a paraconsistent negation to avoid that this, out of this contradiction, we would simply trivialize the system. Because, for example, if I say something and I say that this something is not the case, I'm not saying anything. So I can quite say anything because I don't have any basis to ground myself on. So this is the problem in the phenomenon of the explosion. You know. But the problem of the paraconsistency is to consider that the things are really one opposite to the other. Actually, it's much easier to determine that uh, the science is not exact. So there is a contingent and scientifical reason, not absolute knowledge involved, to make one doctor say something and the other doctor say another something. So we are not really talking about real a real contradiction around here. Actually, only the medicine is not exact enough. But the connective of nullification, it will be responsible only to negate the negation itself. This is the contradiction, the only contradiction that the nullification wants to avoid. It's a logical two that would make the negation of the act of negate, which is something from the knowledge. So I can deny knowledge without entering into the contradiction that I'm denying knowledge with the denial. This is the definition of disconnective, and it is responsible just to negate this one. So and we are not talking about science, about contingent knowledge about this world, like in sciences, opinions, or etc. So that would be good because the real objective of the theory of no knowledge in creating a new science is like this. T&K proposes a pragmatic approach. Arbitrary units of knowledge represented by X and S, where X is any unit, token, or of knowledge from traditional science, but which receives the new property NS, to indicate that regarding this knowledge, it is not necessary to ponder infinitely about its adjacent definitions, supposedly fundamental, or this would put us in an infinite regression, like I've told you before about the cup. So imagine, the idea is to create a new science in which, in front of each one of the concepts that we have in the traditional science, we'll put this terminology here to indicate that you don't have to think more than the first thought. Think with me. We are really convinced that all the advancements in human history were good for us, but can you see that the humans are still suffering? That we haven't actually solved any problem. So any pretentious will to solve the problem of sadness in this world wasn't effective. So what good was to ponder infinitely about something, always thinking that we can find something more and more fundamental, knowing that we are always stuck in an infinite regress. So this is clearly a waste of time, no? So it would be much better for us to simply stop at the first attempt. Just try once. Okay, and probably you guys are thinking that maybe the society would fall in a dystopic future in which people would start to act as the first action demands, and a lot of things would happen differently in this world. Yes, it will. It will happen this way, but like I've told you before, it doesn't seem that any of our actions nowadays are really sufficient or can be deemed as the perfect way to live. So, why are we still trying to solve problems infinitely? Just act as the first one, and I'm pretty sure that we are going to get used to this. Of course, a lot of things will happen differently from our current situation, our current present. But thinking about this, that would be the most honorable way to act and to live. And there wouldn't be any way to think that I could have done something different, because just the first action would be enough. So let's take a look in a practical example. For example, simply crossing a road. Crossing the road, is it a primitive or holistic decision? Do we have to ponder infinitely, or crossing a road is sufficiently simple to be deemed as a primitive action, something that you don't have to think so much about? The decision to look both ways and cross if there are no cars is a perfect example of X and S. Is it the result of a first practical unity? It does not require multiple reflections, infinite inferences, or absolute guarantees. It starts from perception, judgment, and immediate action in coherence with what is seen, nothing more. It might seem holistic, but it is not, because the person does not calculate statistics, does not project all possible scenarios, does not ponder the mechanics of the car's brakes, etc. They see, decide, and act. Period. This is action based on X and S, arbitrary but functional. How does the NES demonstrate that this is the first decision? NS does not need to prove that this was a first decision chronologic. This demand would presuppose thoughts about time, so you would start to ponder infinitely again. It was the only arbitrary unit assumed as the basis of the action. There was no infinite chain or doubts or rationalizations. That is, it did not fall into the cycle of self contradiction. It was legitimate act of imposition, as every NS decision should be. If the person stopped for hours thinking, what if a car appears out of nowhere? What if I trip? What if a drone hits me? Then, yes, you would have holistic delirium. But if he imposes the unit, it's clear I'm going to cross. He is in the new science. So, what about the ethics behind it? Ines does not promise success. It promises freedom from contradiction, only that. If the person was run over, that does not invalidate the decision. It was still the best decision, the most rational decision that could have been made. The accident is a factor of the world, not a failure of the logic of action. And tragedy does not corrupt the epistemological nobility of the act of deciding just once. It's like saying the death of a warrior does not invalidate his courage. In the same way, the pain of the accident does not contradict the legitimacy of the action. So, in summary, the trivial case of crossing is exemplary, and thus does not kill prudence. It reconfigures it as a finite, direct, honest action without the promise of total control. If the crossing resulted in death, that death was the only one possible within maximum epistemological freedom. And this, within the NS, is not failure, but it is absolute dignity. So instead of pondering infinitely and ask God, why has this happened to me? People wouldn't think about this anymore. They would act as the first action demands, because you don't have to think more than once. And of course, you might be thinking right now that even the first concept can be divided infinitely, but think about it. Okay, this is something that is happening actually, but this is the maximum, the best way that you can act in this world, is believing that there is a first action. There is something that you although you can divide infinitely, you haven't tried to do so. Imagine if each people in this world started to act like this, that would be crazy. Yeah, that would be absolute dignity. But that's it. This is the truth. It's impossible to define that each one of the concepts, either philosophical or scientific, or even religious, are really important for our lives, because they can always be divided in infinite regress. So let's arbitrate for our first decision. And even though it can be infinitely divided, at least you haven't tried to do so, at least not consciously. Even though I can divide infinitely each one of the concepts that I've been using right now, but at least I haven't tried to do so, and that would be the biggest dignity of the human being as a rational mind. So this work's not only intended to be intellectually provocative, but offers a metaphysical and ethical framework that is as severe as it is liberating. In a philosophical landscape saturated with recursive critic and epistemic anxiety, the TNKNS offers something rare, a way out. So the only way to really negate the knowledge is using the nullification, which is something, let's say, extra knowledge, because it is the denial of knowledge itself that not contradicts itself like negating the negation from the knowledge, but it's a new concept outside knowledge, and doing it so we start to create the first non-contradictory unities, like any concept of the traditional science, but with a ns parameter beside it, saying that you cannot think like infinitely about that object and start to act as your first demand, as your as a first thought, so that's it. I challenge each one of you to show me something more certain than this, something more with more dignity than this, and prove me wrong. Try to prove me that this isn't the truth of the world. Try to prove me that there is something with less probability, less chance to be wrong. This is the thing that has the less chance to be wrong. So that's it. Thank you for your attention, and I hope that you read this text with more details and try to ponder or not what the future can actually hold for us, considering that all the knowledge that we have is useless. And that would be maybe the best proof to demonstrate that life is senseless. And neither that.